Thank you for joining us in another episode panel in our DIY attribution series. And this is a topic I think is really important for us to cover because how many of us have poured our heart and soul into attribution only to see it not adopted? Yeah. So I think it's really important that we talk about, yes, adoption and what causes people to disengage once you put those reports in front of them. So what before we do that, let's introduce all of our guests. I'm so sorry. So I'm Kamala Thompson. I am working for Caliber Mind. Let's go around the horn. Andy, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm Andy Curran. I'm the SVP of Consulting at Revenue Pulse. I have been in MOPS since before it was MOPS. I built my first attribution reporting sort of build out in 2013, and it's been a passion ever since.
Great. Drew, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Drew Smith. I'm the CEO and founder of Attribution, which is a marketing consulting firm that specializes in marketing attribution. I've worked in probably upwards of about 100 different instances of marketing attribution. So seen a lot of good adoption and bad adoption and everywhere in between. So.
And last but not least, Nick.
Hey, I'm Nick Nemethy. I lead growth ops at Radar. We're location infrastructure for websites and mobile apps. Been in marketing operations for probably around 7 years now, switching between digital and ops roles. But yeah, been a part of a lot of attribution work, and yeah, excited for this discussion.
Sweet. So let's dig into it, and I'm going to let whoever wants to jump in, and then I'll make sure everybody has equal time to speak. But are there any consistent red flags we've seen over the years that might lead us to believe a project might not get adopted? I guess we'll start there.
I can kick this off. I think unrealistic expectations or not a clear level set on what the outcome that's possible versus what's desired or envisioned. Misalignment early on, especially where it's not identified as misalignment, is kind of a swift and sure killer, I think, of end results.
Drew, I know you're passionate about that one, so I'll let you attack the silver bullet.
Yeah. So, well, I was gonna chime in and add on a little bit with the misalignment that Andy just talked about. I see a lot of misalignment in folks between what attribution provides and then just what they're comfortable and used to reporting on. That migration from the old vanity metrics to more pipeline and revenue-based metrics is a difficult migration, and a lot of organizations don't do a good job with the change management there, and so they still report on the stuff they're used to, even though they've got this new improved capability over here. And then I would just say, generally speaking, like with the silver bullet comment is, organizations that are looking for a silver bullet, that's not really what attribution is for. I would say attribution is the antithesis of a silver bullet, because a silver bullet means I'm looking for one thing, whereas attribution is more commonly known as multi-touch attribution, which means multiple things, right? And that's where we get into like some more, I think, just advanced concepts. Like, instead of trying to find that silver bullet that's going to make marketing perform better, it's like, hey, if we had 10% over here, if we reduce 2% over here, if we increase 15% over here, that's a formula that should increase our pipeline by 30%, right? And so it's little increases and incremental decreases in different areas, as opposed to, hey, webinars, let's do more webinars.
Nick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can add to that a bit. I think just in my experience, it's been, starting the conversations early, getting all the right stakeholders in the room, and not kind of like jumping from jumping straight into multi-touch attribution, but rather just like kind of explaining the intention behind why you would want to use a tool like that. I think a lot of people have a hard time, especially people that aren't in marketing, like wrapping their head around like, how am I going to use this, or why are things weighted a certain way? So yeah, again, just starting the conversation early and kind of like internally educating, I guess, can help a lot, as getting like initial reactions to like and answering some of those questions up front before like you even kick off a project can just help set the stage and get a lot better adoption further down the project timeline.
I really love that point, because I see so many people who are responsible for the project thinking of attribution as a marketing tool, when in fact their executive wants to use it in a very cross-functional way. So it's kind of developed in a silo. When the marketer, the CMO wants to turn around and use it for ROI with finance, or they want to use it in the boardroom to represent, departmental effort. So let's talk about maybe some of the ways people want to use it and potential things that we can do up front to make that more useful for them.
So I think a lot of people want a tool to tell them what to do.
Yes.
Right? It's not that they want the data so that then they can make data-driven decisions, although they talk about data-driven decisions, they actually want the decisions. And that's not what attribution is. That's what you hire a headcount to manage attribution for, is to have someone to read that data and help you make those decisions in collaboration with the larger goals and strategy of the organization, and then laddering that down into OKRs and KPIs that are aligned against the data that you're creating. I see a lot of times people aren't creating the data that they actually need as an output to make those decisions, or they're jumping into it and not having clean data, or their data is non-existent, and expecting it to tell them stuff right away. So I think part of it is aligning against what your actual benchmarks for success are as an organization. And I mean that as a department and also as an entire company. But also looking forward to what data you need to make those decisions and starting to generate that, and preparing yourself as an organization for the fact that if you started creating that data today and your sales cycle is 6, 12, 18 months, that it's going to be a while until you have an output of actual concrete revenue, pipeline maybe sooner, but revenue to benchmark against to even know what success is in the long term.
Right. That translation error or layer is such a missing piece in a lot of organizations. I see Nick in his organization, he's in attribution all the time. He's really familiar with the data and he's able to translate that for other folks. Not everybody can see patterns and anomalies the same way that other folks can, but I would love to dig in a little bit more with this team on the data hurdles that aren't always solved. I think of multi-layered campaign hierarchies and lack of rigor around or consistency around campaign types, campaign members. Are there other big areas that people should think about just because of how critical it is to being able to visualize the data?
My favorite one is the just willy-nilly UTMs, but Nick, I would love to know what you're thinking.
Yeah, UTMs are a big one. I was gonna, I can add to that. I think I've worked at huge enterprises and startups, and no matter where I go, there's always a misconception around like what UTMs are. I think everyone's so familiar with like the concept of Salesforce campaigns, and they kind of understand that like the ad team uses UTMs, or like certain teams use UTMs, but they don't really understand that they're kind of like one and the same in a way. But yeah, I would just backing up a little bit. I think laying like your data foundation first, like always have to do that. And knowing your data and trusting your data, being able to speak to it before you layer on attribution is probably like the biggest thing, the most important thing you can do before even looking for like a, software attribution vendor. But yeah, UTMs, I think, at the end of the day, just having all your ducks in a row in terms of just like data organization, naming conventions, it's going to help you, in educating internally on those things first. Helping people just understand the basics of like the primary campaign member, last touch attribution, can go a long way, and just like, okay, like, once I've noticed, like, once people understand how to use that and build reports around that, then talking about kind of like a multi-touch approach often lands a little bit better, and it's a bit more exciting because they can kind of see a more complete story of how customers are interacting with their campaigns and moving through the funnel.
Well, and I think just to add on to what you're saying, Nick, I think one of the things that I run across all the time is when folks are starting to, do an implementation of an attribution platform, we run into a scenario where they have not intentionally designed their data from the get-go. Everything is accidental or incidental. There's no intentional design behind it. Like, you talked about UTMs and you kind of touched on Salesforce campaigns a little bit, but I mean, I work with clients where we were doing an onboarding and we were doing the campaign mapping, and we're talking about, hey, how you use campaigns and campaign members. And they had 15 different campaign member statuses that all indicated that somebody attended an event that included like typos and misspellings of the word attend. And it's like, how can you possibly expect to have good reporting when you aren't even spelling things correctly and you're allowing typos to persist in your data for 3 years? I mean, you cannot expect to have good reporting data when your rigor around data accuracy is so low. Like, those simple things are some of the biggest barriers that people have. And those things have to be achieved before you can start moving on to attribution. And then I just wanted to kind of also go back to something Andy said previously, which is setting the proper expectations for when the data is going to become mature. We have folks that we talk to all the time that, they buy the attribution tool and they're like, okay, great. So when can I start generating insights? And my answer is always, how long is your sales cycle? Because, it's not like you can start generating insights within a month if you have a 12-month sales cycle. You just can't. And so we have to people need to have the proper expectations for how long it takes for that data to mature and fully bake before you can start generating insights. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't start looking at leading indicators and using those along that journey. It doesn't mean you get zero value until you're a full sales cycle in, but it means you have to identify what those leading indicators are and set the proper expectations. Within 90 days, we can report on this. Within 6 months, we can report on pipeline. Within 12 months, we can start reporting on revenue. But that's when we can start reporting on revenue. Doesn't mean that everything's fully baked in 12 months. That means when you can start reporting on this thing. So those expectations are way, way, way off, generally speaking. And that's one of the first things that we have to do is help set those expectations with folks, because if you don't set those expectations, because we're all talking about adoption here. If you don't set those expectations, somebody goes in and they're trying to report on revenue within 3 months of implementing a solution, and there's no revenue there, and they get discouraged because, well, wait, I thought we'd be able to get to this by now. No, you can't.
Yeah. And I think I see that a lot with, sometimes it's inexperience and not knowing what you don't know. So if you're new to ops and you don't know what the ideal state at each stage is for reporting, you don't anticipate all of the things that you need to do to prep for that. And it's understandable and rarely malicious. And then, there's some folks that don't have, either experience or aptitude for prepping for that. So having a good ops person who has seen what ideal looks like somewhere else can really go a long way in helping avoid some of these landmines. But I would love to touch a little bit more on the education piece around attribution, because I feel like how executives view the world and how attribution is structured, very different things, particularly with the CEO who comes up and asks, how much revenue did we get 2 weeks after an event with the 6 to 9 month sales cycle?
I think they're used to having projections, right? And so that's what they're asking for. But I think that we're talking about really different languages, right? There's a gal who I have tremendous esteem for, who talks a lot about geek speak for the C-suite, right? So
Yes.
this idea of like how the C-suite thinks, how they talk, the questions that they're asking, the things that they're asking for, versus someone who's actually technical or analytical or enough to be providing that data and how they're thinking about it and what they're delivering. I think those things don't always meet in the middle. And then I think also executives, particularly in mid to smaller size organizations, are often pulled in, with the checkbook at the end of the sales conversation, and they get this spiel, right, on all the cool things that this is going to do for them, and not necessarily the accurate picture too. So I think that there's two sides to that around expectation. One is the internal conversation around alignment and expectation. The other one is the accurate understanding of what you've actually purchased if you are using a third-party tool.
So fair. And I've tried so hard for us to be very honest about what we do and don't do, because I've been the person putting things in place and having to reset expectations based on what it could do. I'd love to hear from Drew and Nick on internal education.
Yeah, I mean, I think CEOs particularly have this mindset that everything can be, like, all deadlines and all timelines are movable depending on the amount of effort and will you're willing to put into something. And that's part of what makes people CEOs, and what makes them good CEOs is that they're, that they can get timelines accelerated through force of will and by, adding more resources and things like that. But there's some things that some timelines just are what they are. I mean, you cannot, the only way to speed up your time to value when time to value is based on your sales cycle is to speed up your sales cycle. So if you want faster time to value, speed up your sales cycle. If you can't do that, well, you can't speed up time to value. So I think CEOs are just so used to being able to do that they always push for that. And in some cases, it's just not possible. And I think that's why it's so important that organizations, particularly once you start getting into things like marketing attribution, it's good to invest in people talent as well that can speak the language of data in a way that helps a CEO or a CFO understand that, no, you cannot just accelerate this by having somebody work an extra 4 hours in the week. Like, I can't just do more work in a spreadsheet to accelerate this process and get us faster time to value. You have to have somebody that can speak the language and understands data and statistics enough to be able to represent that to a CEO or CFO in a way that's understandable and in the language that they speak. And I think that's an area where a lot of organizations have underinvested, is in that more data and statistically minded folks that can speak that language and tell that story. And I think that's one of the things, it's a huge indicator for when I'm working with clients. I can tell instantly which clients are going to be super successful. It's because they have that person that speaks data, that speaks statistics, and can present that story.
Well, it's not only speaking it, though, they have enough clout to push back. So a lot of people are intimidated by the C-suite, and they are afraid that if they say they can't do something within a certain timeline, they can find somebody else who'll say they can. So that's why I think it's so important for the vendor to try to be as honest as possible, because they're an outside party and are setting expectations for the organization. Nick, what are your thoughts on education, particularly around getting executives to adopt the tool?
Yeah. I think, starting the conversations early, and frequently throughout the project, I found that, when you get into those calls, especially with like the C-suite, and you're trying to introduce something as complex as multi-touch attribution, like I've been in instances where my C-suite is, I'm working in tech, like they get it, they've done this before, and it's a much easier conversation. I think one mistake I've personally made in the past is like kind of coming to the table, like trying to have everything baked out. Like, here are the reports, here's kind of like how we're going to do things. And I think it's good to propose some ideas around how to utilize a tool and like how it should be utilized. But what I found is more valuable is kind of asking them for what they want to answer. And sometimes you can get that up front before you even hop on a call. Sometimes when they're looking at reports or looking at data and you're walking through it, they start to ask more questions. And that can kind of guide like the usage of a multi-touch attribution tool. That's in my current role, like that's, a lot of the reports that we use on a weekly basis came about that way. And I think, I can't emphasize enough just like building trust through understanding your data. So you're going to get questions, especially the C-suite. They're going to ask like, as you start digging in and poking into reports, like you're going to get questions around, why is this way, or where did this come from? If you can clearly communicate like what's behind the data and why it is that way, or if like don't expect your data to be perfect, but at least be able to communicate why it's not perfect, you'll build a lot of trust with the C-suite. And I found that you just generally are going to have more success when you kind of have that data foundation that you understand how to speak to.
Solid. Yes. So in most onboarding that I've been a part of, I talk to the executive stakeholder, and what they're really ultimately looking for is a more sophisticated way to dole out departmental credit for how much each department did in terms of pipeline and bookings. Having been a VP of marketing, I understand where that question's coming from, and that marketing leaders are being put under a tremendous amount of pressure, either from the board or their CEO, to do exactly that. Maybe we start with how attribution is normally structured and why it's not usually in alignment with that ask.
So I always talk about attribution, and not ROI because that's an extension of attribution, right? But just the core function of attribution as essentially being the baseline data for a conversation that you would have with your portfolio manager, provided that you have enough money to have a portfolio manager, for stocks, etc. Right? It is, where are we making the most in return for the dollars that we're spending? Where are we seeing the most potential benefit? Where are things not performing that we maybe back off of? Where do we move levers and change things around to get more bang for our buck? It is budgeting optimization, spend optimization, investment optimization. It is not about the other pieces, although those can be baked in to create that data, to have those conversations. But at its core, It's about getting a better outcome for the dollars that you've put in your investment portfolio against your marketing spend.
Yeah, I have clients that I work with all the time that want to go down this idea of departmental credit. And every time they start going down this path, I cringe because you end up fighting over pennies, or what's the saying? You're stepping over dollars to pick up nickels or something along those lines. I think I just butchered it, but I mean, you've got folks that are fighting for credit and missing sight of the big picture, which is, how do we do better as an organization and win more together, as opposed to how do we win more individually? Because individual wins don't always turn into organizational wins. And so I think, there's this just kind of internal organizational pressure to do this departmental credit thing. But every time I see organizations do this, they're almost doomed to fail. Because one, attribution isn't designed to look at departments. Number one. Number two, when you start doing that, you start prioritizing the wrong behaviors. You start optimizing attribution credit for your department, as opposed to trying to actually do what's best for the revenue of the organization. And I've got a perfect example of this. I was working with a client recently where we were talking about how their events team, their events department, is trying to optimize their attribution credit. And what they were doing is they looked at the attribution models and they saw, well, this attribution model that we want to use is skewed towards sourcing new leads. And so we're gonna skew our events towards sourcing new leads, because that's where we're going to get the most attribution credit. And so I was on the phone with the analyst at this organization. I was like, let's see if their hypothesis is actually true. And we looked at the event attribution across multiple different attribution models simultaneously. And what the attribution models were saying is that they actually are generating more influence and more attributed value later in the funnel by working with folks that are already, by engaging with folks that are already in opportunity cycles or are near an opportunity being created, as opposed to generating net new records. So one, they're ignoring the evidence, the actual data. They're coming to an incorrect conclusion about how they should optimize events, all because they're trying to manipulate the attribution model to make sure that they get the most attribution credit they possibly can for their events. So they're doing so many wrong things because they're just trying to increase their particular departmental attribution credit. And it's like, if you were to do this long-term as your long-term event strategy, you would be actually taking value away from the organization.
Absolutely.
To increase your own department's organizational credit. And that's not what we want attribution to be. That's not what attribution is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, hey, how do we do better events and get more for our events, not manipulate the attribution.
Which trade shows actually have a better outcome? What audience goes to those? That's our target, right? Not, I've seen similar things too, where the model will have a requirement of a certain number of touches within a certain number of days prior to opportunity creation. And so what marketers were doing was actually forcing that second or third interaction or engagement so that the first one would show up in the reporting so that they got any credit at all. And they were potentially chasing away business by over engaging or trying to generate engagement where there wasn't any. It was scary, to be honest. It was just scary.
And it's part of why we started using attribution, is to move away from a lead volume model and move towards pipeline and bookings optimization. Yeah, many thoughts are popping in my head. Nick, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think, one approach that I've seen work pretty well is just like kind of uncoupling like sales and marketing credit. I think if we're just talking about marketing, to me, it's that is the whole purpose of multi-touch attribution, is to be able to look at how is an event impacting pipeline more holistically, and like specifically where along the journey. We have several events that we do every year that we know are more pipeline acceleration events. But if we were doing just like your traditional, like who sourced the deal kind of attribution, it would look like those are the biggest waste of time. When in reality, it's like they're so key for renewals, expansions, and like existing pipeline. But going back to just like, I think there is some value in like who sourced the deal. I think, what team is opening the op. Was it business development? Was it sales? I think there's also like if you had to put a label on like, marketing source, I kind of just look at it as like inbound or sign up, but depending on, what your business model is. But it's very hard for people to step away from that like kind of single touch mentality. I've found, but I think if you can rally your whole organization around just like, hey, let's all work together to drive revenue, which is a really hard thing to do. But I've been there, and it can be super empowering across the org when you're not so hyper focused on department, like each department's specific performance, or maybe laying out specific key performance indicators for each department that aren't directly like leading indicators, and lagging indicators could be helpful as well.
Yeah, I get why people ask the questions. And a lot of times it's stemming from sales saying all the leads they get from marketing are really bad, and they're having to do all of their pipeline sourcing. And marketing's trying to defend what they're doing because, some of the things are working well. Let's not throw out the whole thing.
I think credit is an actually really powerful indicator, or can be, for leadership. That they have, if not an antagonistic, then in potentially unhealthy dynamic or relationship between sales and marketing. And that is actually where the focus could or should be, to mend that first, right? Or to get it into a healthier place, rather than implementing a tool or a practice before they've figured it out. It's like, if your kids are fighting, you're not going to give them a single popsicle and expect them to stop fighting, right? Like, you've got to actually get them separated first, and then figure out where you go from there.
Right. Because they're always both right when they're pointing fingers at each other. They just haven't figured out, what of this feedback from sales is valid, and what can I adjust on my side to make things easier for them? Am I passing through everything? Maybe I pull back things like content syndication. I really look really hard at my gated content because that's not converting. Like, there's a lot of things that can be done to help bridge the gap between teams, and feedback loops are a big part of that.
I always say it's deciding what kind of Olympics team you're going to be. Are you going into the games like a swim team where each person can medal and you're potentially competing against each other? Or are you going in as the soccer team where you're all going to kick the ball down the field and, get medals together?
And some leaders have it in their heads that pitting the teams against each other actually produces more. And research has shown over and over again, it doesn't.
Yeah, I will never understand why, when we get into these attribution conversations, sales teams, and I'm not picking on sales here, I'm just saying that I see it happen a lot, where marketing starts showing, hey, look at this attribution that we're doing, and we're actually influencing opportunities and deals, and sales gets defensive, and they're like, well, without us, none of these close. And it's like, we're not coming for your credit. We're not coming for your commission. Calm down. We're not going to come steal your commission. That's not what we're doing here. You still get commission. Every deal, we're not an e-commerce business here. So every deal goes through you. We're not trying to diminish your involvement and your value in the organization. All we're trying to say is, hey, look, marketing's actually sitting at the same table you are. We're not trying to take your seat away from the table. We're just trying to give ourselves a seat at the table and also show how we're adding value to the organization. And that doesn't diminish you at all. It doesn't diminish your shine at all. You're still the superstars in the organization that closing all the deals.
But tell me it doesn't make a difference when the person you're contacting has already heard about your organization and your product and all of these other things, as opposed to just coming in completely cold.
I sell every single one of my own deals. So I am the sales guy and I'm the marketing guy in my organization. And when somebody comes in having heard of Attribution in some way, shape, or form, and I don't have to sell them on Attribution, it's a much easier sale, always, 100% of the time. So there's no reason for sales to get defensive when marketing starts saying, hey, we're helping, influence deals. And I think that defensiveness doesn't help things. And I think sales organizations need to just understand better that marketing's not coming for your commission. You're still going to get all your commission. Marketing's just trying to get a seat at the same table you already have a seat at. So let them pull up a seat, and that doesn't cause you any issues at all. Now, at the same time, though, when sales comes back and says, hey, marketing, you're sending us crap leads, marketing at the same time also has to be able to say, hey, look, maybe we are. And to your point, Kamala, how can we send better leads? How can we, if marketing comes and gets defensive at that and immediately says, well, you're not even actioning on the leads we send you. Now you're just that starts the whole adversarial relationship. And now you've got two people pulling a rope in opposite directions, as opposed to pulling the same rope in the same direction. You're going to work using athletics and Olympics, like tug of war kind of thing here. If you got two people pulling the same rope in the same direction, you're going to make a lot more progress than two people trying to pull the rope opposite directions. Yeah.
I've actually been in an organization where the sales team was complaining about stuff. We saw that they weren't following up on things. They actually randomly routed a portion to me, and I did the follow-up. And that was a humbling experience, because it's like, well, no wonder they aren't following up on these. We need to change how we're doing things. So I don't know if it's always possible to walk a mile in their shoes, but I think defensiveness on either side. And my first two attribution projects started out really horribly because of exactly what you're saying. I had a VP of sales who saw this chart and said, BS, marketing is responsible for 80% of pipeline and bookings. Are you kidding me? So it's like walking into a buzzsaw.
Well, I think the big thing there is, if that's the experience between sales and marketing, what does it feel like to be a prospect or a customer going through that journey with something that bumpy, right?
Yeah. Well, and to your point though, Kamala, if a VP of sales sees that marketing is responsible for 80% of pipeline, and their immediate reaction is that's BS, there's something behind that. That there's something that's driving that reaction. Because if that were true, and there was and sales was loving, the leads that marketing is sending over, the VP of sales wouldn't have that immediate reaction. So there is something there to be investigated, to find out whether that 80% is true or not. But the immediate reaction of, that's BS, unless there's something behind that, then that's kind of a red flag that there's something going wrong.
Right. And it was pitched incorrectly in this case. So this particular tool I inherited only looked at marketing campaign data. So the right way to pitch that is marketing is interacting with 80% of the deals at some point. That's all that was saying. That was a misrepresentation. If we could, so we've talked a lot about red flags, what we should do differently. I have heard some things about what we should do as part of a project. So maybe we talk about the education process. So I'm hearing, you have to have somebody in place who understands the data, can gather the requirements, and understands the gaps. That's like numero uno. But as part of an education plan, Nick, I would love to hear from you and how you prepped your organization.
Yeah. I think, I've taken different approaches. Most recently, it was largely like just involving, especially if you're working with a vendor. Actually, let me back up a little bit. Just when I was laying the data foundation, in my current role, deciding on naming conventions, campaign infrastructure, kind of like educating as we go, or like, at kind of breaking up the whole project into little phases and validating with the stakeholders that, I know are going to be using these reports or wanting to look at this data, that they understand it and they agree on it. Like, hey, we're going to classify, these UTMs as like in this lead source bucket. Like, here's how we're going to bucket things so we can look at them at a high level. Here's how you're going to be able to drill down. Like, does this look good to you? Anything you want to change there? Not just kind of like running with whatever you think is best, but making sure that, because every organization I've worked at, like there's different needs and requirements. People want to look at things. It's just, again, making sure that you have the right people in those conversations. So, after kind of laying the foundation, it was more about, like, okay, we have all this, we have really good data now. We have a good foundation laid. We're starting to see reports. We're doing like single touch attribution. That was like a huge stepping stone. Like, what's next? How can we get more value out of this data and insight? And that's where, a multi-touch model approach came into play. And those, I guess, kind of same approach, involving the right people. But I think if you're looking at like when you're looking at software attribution, finding a solution that like it's more of a partnership versus like, here's the software, go figure it out. Here's your black box of attribution, like plug your data in and figure it out. Maybe that's one way to do it. I've seen like less adoption in the past with those types of tools, where if it is more of like an onboarding experience and they can kind of explain how they're going to use your data, and involving those same people, those key stakeholders in those conversations, it kind of just helps turn the gears for them on like, okay, like here's the direction we're going. Here's kind of the roadmap and what we can expect. But I guess, long story short, not just like dropping an education bomb on everybody, like, hey, we're rolling out multi-touch attribution. Like, this is what you have to use now. That will fail like 9 times out of 10, in my opinion. It's more like, kind of a show and tell, kind of like, a drip of education. It's kind of like when you're nurturing prospects. It's like, they're not just going to be ready after one touch. It's when you're talking about demand gen or something, it takes time. You got to educate. There's different stages of awareness. So it's the same thing internally when you're selling a tool like this.
And I really like that, because I see a lot of people assume that their marketing team understands member statuses and why they're important, or whether something's a response or not, and why they should care about that. Nobody starts out in marketing understanding how all the data is connected and what's important there. So telling them why can go a really long ways, and so can installing a free installed package in your CRM, or setting up a flow automation that does it for them. Like, there's a lot of things you can do, but I like how your approach includes the why along the way. That's really great.
One thing that I try to do a lot of is that I think is just one of the biggest, it's one of the easiest things to do, but it's also a huge barrier when you don't do it, is developing a shared language throughout the organization. How many times have you heard folks say in marketing say, well, we're sending leads to sales, and sales is like, those aren't leads. And you aren't even using the same language to describe the same things. I think developing a shared language and a consistent language is really important to getting things like this adopted. Because if you don't have a language that people can understand in different departments and different functional roles, you're never going to get this thing off the ground. And I'm also very careful about the words that we choose to use, because what I've noticed is when we start saying things like credit or caused, that
ROI.
tends to lead to fights, right? Like that leads us to go down these paths of credit. Like, well, this campaign caused this opportunity to get created. Well, no, it didn't, because there were 3 phone calls in between that campaign and that opportunity. So no, it didn't. And as a matter of fact, even if there were no phone calls in between, that's making a logical assumption of what's going on in the brain of the end user, that this campaign caused this opportunity to get created. No, it didn't. Again, you can't assume that. So I try to get rid of certain words that either trigger disputes or that are based on assumptions. And instead of using credit or caused, we change to more neutral terms, and we change to terms that are less assumptive in nature. Because like there's not a big difference between the word influenced and caused, with the exception of knowing what's going on in somebody's brain, right? You can't dispute that this campaign influenced this opportunity. You can absolutely dispute that this campaign caused this opportunity. And so I try to work with clients to get to create a shared language, and that is a very specific, that uses specific terms that steer conversations away from the landmines and steer conversations towards where we want them to go, which is this collaborative world where we're talking about how do we just do better to all win more as an organization. So I focus a lot on language, and I think that organizations that are really, really good at this, they have a shared language and they're very intentional with the words they choose to use.
Oh yeah, like if you want to work with finance and use a multi-touch attribution for ROI calculations, talk to finance about how they think about those things, explain your approach, and you're going to have a dialogue and some back and forth and compromise every time.
When I learned that the hard way, when I first started with attribution, and I was delivering an attribution report to a CFO, and I said, marketing influenced X amount of revenue, and the CFO just barks at me, that's not revenue. I was like, wait, what do you mean? He's like, that's not revenue. Those are not paid invoices. Those are bookings or sales, but that's not revenue.
Yep.
I'm like, oh, yes. Okay, you're right. I mean, I know the difference, like, just mentally, I know the difference, but like I chose the wrong words to use with the wrong audience. And so that immediately discredited everything that was in the report because we were just calling it the wrong thing. Yeah. And so that, those are the types of things that can completely derail adoption because I chose to use the word revenue instead of bookings or sales.
Andy, would love to hear from you and what you think is necessary in any kind of rollout plan.
So I think with a rollout plan, you need to obviously have, a shared set of goals, outcomes. You need to have a timeline in place. You need to understand who is going to be delivering on necessary items to get you to the finish line and what the impact is if those are delayed or not made available on time. And then you need to have, what the phased approach is going to be as far as layering and adoption of that data, when data will become available, what your anticipated final sort of outcome is, and then how you're going to schedule time around optimizing what is already existing, vetting it against the team. I think there's a lot of different things that go into rollout, but those are some of the more change management pieces, maybe around the culture that I think are key in my mind. And obviously there's all the technical data prep and all the other things that are going on, behind the scenes, but organizationally, I think those are some of the things to think about.
Fantastic. Erica, do we have any questions?
We do have a couple of questions. First up from the chat, how can less experienced people on the attribution implementation team level up so they can tell the story better?
Practice. Start doing it. Figure out what you don't know. Figure out that you should be calling it bookings. Fail forward. If you don't try, you won't figure it out. Honestly, I think that fear or like, I don't know everything. No one knows everything. No one on this call knows everything. We learn something new on a daily, weekly, monthly basis.
Yeah, talk to your community. Ask people who've been through it a lot.
That's what I was about to say is, there's attribution in the attribution world. There's not a lot of experts out there because it's still so new and still gaining a foothold, but there are some. And so ask the folks that have done this before, that have been successful before. There are communities out there that can help with this stuff. So just ask those questions. I've stepped on a lot of those landmines, so you don't have to. Like the revenue versus bookings thing. Don't make that same mistake.
Yeah. Don't position a multi-touch attribution model that only looks at campaign data as marketing share of stuff. You just go do it. Yeah. Great advice.
All right. We have a couple more here. We've rolled out attribution to our organization, and my marketing leader tells me they can't show the model to sales because they won't believe it. What can I do?
Oh,
Model is not for sales, so don't show it to sales.
yeah. Yeah. It sounds like an education gap with the marketing leader. So it sounds like they want to use it to show departmental contribution, which I see all the time. And you're going to have to take a really hard look at how your model is structured and talk about when you're not representing sales effort, you can't use it that way. You may walk into a situation where they're going to want to include that information so they can use it that way. So have a really open back and forth dialogue about what they're trying to use it for versus how it was set up and what it's really good at doing. Anyone else?
I guess like my first question that popped in my head was like, what's the intention of showing it? I think for me, like I try to rally everyone around, like, we want to see marketing touches involved in the sales process. Like if you're B2B and like you're moving through opportunity stages, like sales and marketing should be involved in every opportunity. So it's like, I would say first is kind of building on what you just said, Kamala, which is like, separating the two. Like it's not a credit game. That report should be used to understand like what is actually influencing revenue from marketing's end. And there's going to be overlap with sales, but it shouldn't be looked at as like, where's our credit? Like, where is sales credit in this report? That's not what if that's not what the report is designed to do. Sure, there's reports that can pull in sales touches if that's what you want to show, but if it's just marketing data, and I guess I would go back to the question of like, what are we trying to take away from this? Or what do I want the sales team to take away from this? For me, it's, kind of sounds like more of a report that might be just useful for the marketing team to look at and strategize on where to double down.
Yeah, I mean, the CMO isn't having a bad instinct in this instance. It's good they didn't just put it in front of the sales team. I just think there's misalignment on what it was built for versus what they wanted. Yeah.
I would also say, don't be afraid of the tough conversation that's behind that. You might learn some things as part of that conversation. I mean, you might come in and say, well, webinars are doing a great job. They're influencing 25% of our pipeline. And sales comes back and says, yes, but every single one of the leads we get is garbage. So they're, except for like 2 that have been good. And so you might end up getting some really good feedback in the process. So don't be afraid of the tough conversation that might be behind that.
Yeah, maybe we have a weaker lead gen strategy and we're really good at building awareness and educating in-flight deals, but we haven't nailed that middle part of the funnel. Like that could be totally valid.
Time for one more?
Yep.
All right. We have a multi-touch model everyone is signed off on, but my marketing team isn't logging in and using the tool. What's next?
Why aren't they logging in and using the tool? I mean, let's ask the question directly. Like, we've given you this tool, we've given you this stuff. Why aren't you using it? If you ask the question, you're likely to get some interesting answers that maybe the data is not trustworthy. Maybe we need more training in how to use the tool. There could be a number of reasons why they're not using the tool. So let's ask the question.
Yeah. And I think I have a slightly different perspective in that we need a lot of different skill sets in marketing, and it's really rare to find a creative and analytical person in one. So talking to your CMO or ops leader about needing additional headcount to supply them proactively with insights, and then really having an honest dialogue with your CMO about what are your expectations for the team, because you're setting the tone. Can we have weekly data reviews? Will you support that? Will you show up? Will you participate?
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't log in to tools because it's not part of their routine or their cadence. They haven't built it in, right? It takes doing something a certain number of times, days, weeks before that becomes normalized, right? And something that people are like, oh yeah, next I do this and da. I think having things where if you do have, a weekly team meeting or a monthly team meeting, that, you're making the dashboarding, the reporting part of that meeting and part of that conversation to give people that taste. It's kind of like, Starbucks or something. When they would introduce a new drink, they'd put the little mini cups out there. They'd be like, oh, you want a sample, blah, 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 right? Because they want to get you hooked. You have to sell and market, to Nick's point earlier, right? These things to your marketing team to get them to actually get a taste for it and then start to have, that thirst for that data.
And there may be a lack of aptitude too, and it doesn't make them a bad marketer. Maybe they're really excellent, but they may get information overload when they open a report. That's valid. I would be really worried about a digital marketer not being able to adapt and utilize the data, because that's how you adjust and learn over time, and digital particularly. But let's say event marketing. I know a lot of data savvy event marketers, and I know some who just shut down when there's a report in front of them.
Well, I think to your point in aptitude, there's a certain group of marketers out there, and I don't say anything negative about them because it's not part of their job. They shouldn't be doing this. They can't tell you the difference between mean, median, and mode. It's because they haven't had to think about it since high school statistics class. You can't expect those people to suddenly turn on a statistical portion of their brain that they haven't used in years. You can't expect them to do that just because this stuff is now available to them. And then the other question is, do you want them doing that? Somebody that hasn't used that portion of their brain since high school because they're better at something else. Do you want them doing that? Or do you want to hire somebody who that's what they're good at, and that's what their brain is wired for in that moment because they're doing it on a regular basis? Sometimes it's not even a matter of aptitude. It's just what people are doing on a daily basis. And do you want them constantly switching gears in their brain? Because that actually makes it so that it takes longer to get back to what you were doing before. to transition back to a creative mindset or an event mindset or whatever. So if the more you ask people to switch between how their brains are operating, the less efficient they become. So do you even want them doing that?
Well, there's a lot of stigma with creative types told that they can't math, you know, so you're also bumping up against that. We are at time. I want to thank everyone for participating and sharing your experience, the good, the bad, the everything in between. Thank you all.